A political standoff in Washington has pushed the United States government back toward a partial shutdown, spotlighting deep fractures not only between Democrats and Republicans, but within the Republican Party itself. What began as a race to pass routine funding legislation before the fiscal year deadline has escalated into a broader showdown over policy, power, and political leverage, with U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham at the center of the latest upheaval. In the early hours leading up to the funding deadline, lawmakers in Congress found themselves in a familiar, yet increasingly bitter struggle, negotiating how to keep the federal government funded without conceding on deeply contentious policy demands. While both parties have a history of bargaining over spending bills, this cycle has been marked by heightened tension over immigration enforcement, lawmaker protections, and internal disagreements among Republicans. At the heart of the chaos was an agreement reached in the Senate just hours before the shutdown deadline. Senators had agreed to a compromise package designed to fund most of the federal government through the end of the fiscal year, with one notable exception: funding for the Department of Homeland Security, DHS. That funding was carved out to allow additional time for negotiation over reforms demanded by Democrats in reaction to high-profile deaths involving federal immigration agents. The decision was intended to bridge divides, give lawmakers time to negotiate, and stave off a shutdown that would disrupt federal services and impact millions. But before that agreement could secure final approval, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham put the brakes on the deal. Graham's objections were rooted in provisions stripped from the broader spending bill that related to his own legislative priorities, including language tied to the fallout from an investigation into the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol. That provision would have allowed certain lawmakers to sue the federal government for unauthorized access to phone records collected during the probe. When the House moved to repeal that law as part of the broader appropriations effort, Graham balked, insisting he wanted guarantees that related legislation would be considered separately before he would allow a vote on the full funding package. His hold effectively paused the process, leaving lawmakers scrambling as the deadline loomed. Senate leaders and the White House worked frantically to broker assurances that Graham's concerns would be addressed in future votes, including on proposals to require sanctuary cities and states to cooperate with federal immigration enforcement, in exchange for him lifting his blockade. After intense negotiations and assurances from Senate leadership, Graham ultimately agreed to lift his hold, allowing the Senate to pass the funding bill with broad bipartisan support. However, that was only part of the battle. The bill's passage in the Senate did not immediately translate into funding for the government, because the House of Representatives had already recessed until the following week. That meant a technical lapse in funding would occur at midnight, triggering a partial government shutdown even after the Senate vote. Agencies classified as non-essential would be forced to halt operations temporarily, federal workers could be furloughed without pay, and services ranging from national parks to regulatory functions could be disrupted. The shutdown, while expected to be short-lived, underscored just how brittle the pathway to agreement has become. House Republicans, led by Speaker Mike Johnson, faced their own internal pressures. Conservative members have demanded stricter immigration enforcement measures and have pushed back against concessions they see as too favorable to Democratic demands. Meanwhile, Democrats have made it clear they will not simply rubber stamp funding without addressing their own policy priorities, chiefly tighter oversight of immigration and enforcement agencies, following a series of controversial and fatal encounters between federal agents and civilians. Democratic leaders have insisted that reforms, such as requiring body cameras and clear identification for agents, banning random roving patrols, and ending the practice of agents wearing masks during operations, must be part of any deal that includes DHS funding. They argue that without meaningful changes, continued funding of federal enforcement agencies would be tantamount to endorsing practices they see as abusive or unaccountable. Republicans have largely resisted these demands, citing concerns over law enforcement flexibility and national security, further complicating negotiations. As the partial shutdown begins, both sides are regrouping. Negotiators will use the coming days to hammer out their differences in hopes of reopening the government as quickly as possible. Behind the scenes, Lawmakers on both sides stress that while a brief closure is disruptive, it is preferable to passing a rushed agreement that fails to address substantive concerns, whether over immigration policy, lawmaker protections, or agency oversight. The standoff illustrates not just a disagreement over numbers on a page, but a deeper clash over policy direction and political identity in Washington. It reveals how individual lawmakers can wield outsized influence in tightly divided legislatures and how policy fights can overshadow what were once considered routine budgetary procedures. For millions of Americans, the ramifications are immediate. Federal services disrupted, uncertainty over government support systems, and a stark reminder that the machinery of governance can grind to a halt when political accord proves elusive. In the coming days, all eyes will be on Capitol Hill as negotiations continue. Will lawmakers find a path to a broader agreement that satisfies the competing demands, or will the divisions deepen, dragging the government into a longer and more damaging shutdown? The answers will shape not only the immediate functioning of the federal government, but also the political landscape as the country moves further into the 2026 election year and beyond.